Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today our guest is IlluminatiRex, a flair on the subreddit, who's here to talk about a project they did recently looking into local veterans of the First World War in Connecticut. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Just to start off with, what got you into this particular venture?
Well, it's kind of the marriage of a few things. One, my kind of main research area has always kind of been the First World War. And secondly, I helped run the kind of local museum, the local historical society. And it was actually coming up on the 100th anniversary of a local World War I monument. And so I had realized, nobody had really ever finished researching these veterans. The people that were on the monument, and many others, as it turns out. So it really kind of was just born out of that, starting to get this baseline of, First World War veterans in this town.
And what was the process like for looking into these? Because I see you ended up finding, 36 total veterans that you could find? Or was that even more, actually?
More than 36. So the 36 are the ones that were actually living here during the war, and so I would consider to have been, either born or had moved here by the time they were drafted. And in a couple of cases, it actually moved away, but then they got put on the monument afterwards because they'd been born here. So that was one of the baselines. And so for actually kind of finding the names, there's been a few methods I've gone about that. First is looking at local monuments. And monuments aren't always the most accurate sources of information because they reflect what the people who made the monument wanted to say. And that's on full display with our local World War I monuments, where it's a very specific list of individuals. There's 24 names on the first monument from 1921. There's 26 names on the one that was put up in the 1990s, which was essentially the first monument with 2 additions. Then some of the other sources I looked at, Connecticut has put out a very wonderful roster in the 1930s and 40s of World War I veterans, where they listed by town. So there were, I think, somewhere in the mid-20s listed in that roster for my hometown. The fun thing is, not all the names on that roster were on the monument, and not all the names on the monument were on the roster for my hometown. So there's some interesting stuff that went on with that, as well as I ended up walking cemeteries in town and looking for veterans' graves for that time period, and also graves that might not have flags that are from that era as well, just to see, hey, maybe this individual was a veteran, and for whatever reason, there's no flag here. Obituaries and newspaper reports as well from the 60s, 70s, and 80s as these veterans were passing away, and census data as well. So a lot of kind of variety of sources for finding those initial names.
The interesting lead is, of course, the discrepancies between the monuments and the other records. So, thinking specifically about the monuments, who got on the monuments and who didn't?
So it's safe to say, first off, all the people that are on the 1921 monument are white. There was a single African-American veteran from my hometown. Where I live has always predominantly been a very white community. But even during, other conflicts, there have been African-American soldiers and other minority veterans. This wasn't any different in the First World War. And the Black veteran who was excluded, he was actually listed in the state register, in the state roster. And when I was going through that and I saw he was the only African-American, it was pretty clear to me that that's why he had been excluded. Other individuals are a little more difficult to figure out why they had been excluded. For example, there was actually only a single man killed in action from my hometown. And he's not on the 1921 monument. And my initial thoughts were that, okay, well, he's Polish and he's Catholic, and there's no Catholic church in town. This monument was put at the church. Was there something going on here with, because he was Catholic? I don't think that's entirely the reason, because there is at least one Polish Catholic person that's on the monument. So that, I'm not entirely sure why he was excluded. There are other individuals who are kind of from a weird border region where they kind of lived in my hometown, and they kind of lived in the town next door. And there's this, tension between, I guess, between where they actually lived. So they just didn't include them. 2 of them were Navy veterans, actually. And so there's a variety of reasons. There's racial prejudice. There's who knows what. There's these just kind of weird conflicts, essentially, with who lived where. And so there was just a lot of weird discrepancies like that.
You mentioned that only one was killed in action. What really happened to the others?
Most of the others, there were a number of others who did see combat, but most of the others tended to be in non-combat roles. There were a couple mechanics, for instance, who were working with the Army Air Corps. There were some that were involved in the Navy. There was one who was on a mine layer. And there were some artillery guys who were in training. So for those who went overseas, those who saw combat mostly made it out unscathed, and with a few exceptions. There were a couple of individuals who were wounded in action, including that African-American veteran. And again, overall, with the amount of men who served for my hometown, I was kind of surprised there was only one individual who was killed in action, but I guess, that makes us kind of lucky. And actually, about his background is he was actually a Polish immigrant. He was actually born in Eastern Europe and had immigrated here, and then ended up being drafted.
So one thing you noted was that there's 11 who saw some kind of foreign service and 12 who didn't. What sorts of non-foreign service would that entail?
So there were a variety of experiences. For example, one man in particular was posted to a variety of hospitals in the United States, including one in Hot Springs, North Carolina, which was actually the site of an internment camp for German sailors, merchant sailors, who had been on ships that ended up getting interred. That's actually ended up where they were moved to during their internment period. They kind of built up this whole little German village, and so this was the associated hospital to that. There were others who were involved in the chemical warfare services. Many who were involved that were really just in training camp. At that time, they were drafted fairly late into the conflict. So the war, the armistice, November 11th, 1918. Well, what are we going to do? All these extra guys were in training now. We don't really need them in the military, so they end up getting an honorable discharge. So a good chunk of them were in training. Some others were doing other kind of various things around the United States.
Obviously, a lot end up being discharged when the war is over. Did any stay on with the army long term?
For the most part, no. Aside from those who had been in before the conflict, there were a few career soldiers and sailors. One of which in particular had been stationed in the Philippines for the duration of the conflict. He was an officer in the Philippine Scouts. And so there we have, here's this connection to the American Empire and imperialism of this era. And you don't necessarily expect it from a small town like this. And so, the ways that it wasn't just necessarily stuff that was people from the West Coast that was influencing stuff in the Pacific. I mean, you had people from all over.
Because, it's a small town, but it is still a big world. And so I think in that sense, what seems to be particularly notable is the number of people coming in from outside who had been veterans but weren't born there. So what would you say were some of the more interesting cases of those?
I would definitely say a lot of the immigration from Europe. In a small town like this, there tends to be stories built up about kind of the people that have made up the town throughout its history. So there's a couple of prominent families who you hear about a lot when you grow up here. They're kind of like what's thought of as the town's history. They've been here since the 1680s, and they haven't left. But when you kind of start to look into it, you realize there's a lot of other people who made this town what it is. Whether it was Polish immigrants, Russian immigrants, especially in this period. There was actually a significant amount of Irish immigration here in the late 1800s. There was a neighboring mill town. So you have a lot of immigration from these different parts of the world, and a lot of this is really in transient labor. These are people who come here for a short amount of time, work on a farm, do something of that nature before they move on and find better pastures, for lack of a better term. And so it really helps showcase this, really what is patterns of labor in an area like this, where you have the people that are here for a long time and they stay and they become entrenched and they kind of become the idea of the town. But you have all these other people who helped create the town, if that makes sense.
Thinking about that more broadly, where does this put the town in the wider world?
In what sense? Just to kind of
how would you say that looking at the story of local First World War veterans has placed the town in the world for you?
Oh, I would definitely say it's globalized it in many ways. Again, growing up, there was those few English colonists who lived here from the 1600s. But then you start to realize, well, there were a lot of different kinds of people here at all various points in time. Even looking at earlier census data, and while censuses look at one very specific snapshot in time, you see that there's lots and lots of different kinds of people. For example, in the 1910 census, there were a lot of Portuguese immigrants here working on farms. You go back to the 1860s, there were actually a lot of African Americans working on farms. And one of the reasons we actually know that is because a lot of them enlisted in the Union Army during the Civil War. But you start to see this throughout all these various time periods where you start to look at whether it's during a war or during a census year, during any other year when you start to just kind of try to get a cross-section of everyone who was here. And I am lucky that I do live in a small enough town where this is more or less possible. Mm-hmm. And you really do start to see that just how globalizing connected to these larger immigration patterns in the United States and just larger labor patterns and everything that was going on. It was never isolated. It wasn't just English immigrants from the 1600s. Again, you had Polish immigrants, you had Irish immigrants, you had African Americans, you had Portuguese people, Portuguese immigrants. There were, especially by the time you get to like 1920, just after the First World War, there were a lot of Russian families who start to move from New York City. There's Russian Jewish families. There are lots more kinds of people than you ever really expect. That's probably not the best way to phrase it, but there really is just this huge variety of people that were living here. And I'm sure that a lot of them didn't necessarily get along. Again, kind of going back to the example of that African-American veteran. I know from newspaper reports from the 20s, he was the victim of police brutality. And again, he was purposely excluded from the local monument because of the color of his skin. I have no doubts about that. So again, it's not that all these groups necessarily got along, because I am sure they didn't. But that this community is made up of lots of different kinds of people. And there's a lot of diversity here, essentially.
One thing that struck me that you mentioned, that you discovered specifically from the cemetery walks, they died of the Spanish flu. Were they unique in this out of the, now that I check again, 61 that you found, or did the flu affect a larger portion of that group?
Out of the veterans, there was actually, as far as I'm aware, only one individual ended up dying of the Spanish flu. I can't say for certain within the larger population yet. I haven't had a chance to really start digging into that. But yeah, there was one individual who died of Spanish flu, and it was only a couple of weeks after he'd gotten to training camp on Long Island. He had been sent to Camp Upton. And pretty much as soon as he got there, he got sick.
I suppose we've already alluded to a lot of this, but to put it in a consolidated place, what would you say the most valuable part of doing this kind of quite local investigation has been?
It really is the kind of globalization of small town history, and showing that small towns have a lot of history within them that represents those larger trends. Sometimes it's easy to forget that these were real people that were involved in these things, and in whether it's a war or immigration or working a farm job or whatever it is, these were real individuals with real lives and real families, and that it both globalizes my own hometown's experiences and its history, and also puts a very human face on it. And I'm especially lucky with this First World War research. We have a number of photographs from a number of these veterans, so I'm able to put a face to these names, and it gives you again kind of this just snapshot window of what a place like this was at in a specific time, the kinds of people were here, the jobs they did, and just kind of what the social fabric of the community sort of looked like.
Thank you. So, is there anything that we haven't discussed so far that you'd like to bring up as well?
Yeah, one of the more interesting veterans that I discovered was actually a British veteran of the First World War. Again, small town New England, not where you'd expect to find someone who had been born in the United Kingdom and had fought in the First World War to be buried, but again, kind of looking at immigration here, he and his wife immigrated to first Canada in the early 1920s, and then they very quickly moved to New England. They were in a different town in Connecticut for a little while. They had their son there before they ended up moving here, and they ran a poultry farm. But in 1928, sadly, he ended up committing suicide. And I have very few doubts that it was related to the war and his service. He had been an artillery officer, and he had been in pretty much every major action on the Western Front that the British Army was involved in between November 1915 and the end of the war. So I have no doubts in my mind that had played some role in his young death. And I was actually able to get in contact with his granddaughter, who currently lives in Australia, which was absolutely mind-blowing and unexpected. And she actually was able to tell me a lot about her father, who was the son born here in Connecticut, who also had quite the wild life and adventure, where he ended up, during World War II, he was at a boarding school in Switzerland as he and his mother had moved to France after the father had committed suicide. And in the middle of World War II, he decides, you know what, boarding school, I'm not really here for this. So he broke out with a friend. They escaped to Portugal and joined the Portuguese Merchant Marine. They realized the Portuguese Merchant Marine wasn't necessarily the best experience of their lives. So he ended up realizing, wait a second, I'm an American citizen. I was born in the United States. So he comes to the United States and joins the American Merchant Marine. He's a merchant mariner throughout World War II and afterwards. He meets his first wife on board a ship. They end up getting divorced, and he meets his second wife, whom he moves to Australia with and has his children, including the woman who I was able to get in contact with. And again, here's just this like random, story and connection I was able to make because of this research with this woman who I would have never talked with in my life otherwise. Partly because of the, just the space and distance between us, essentially the opposite sides of the world. It was just that was just such a really cool experience getting to talk with her and to help her learn a little bit about her grandfather and the experiences he had gone through, and also just to kind of see again the globalized nature of a small town like this. That sure, there are families that stay here forever and ever. There are also people who move here and live here and have connections to this bigger world.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, with that, I think that's a wrap. Thank you for coming on.
You're very welcome.
And we hope to see you again, perhaps.
Most certainly.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.